Welcome to an overview of the InView aptitude test. The InView has 5 subtests: sequences, analogies, quantitative reasoning, verbal reasoning in words, verbal reasoning in context. It includes a cognitive skills index, which typically whenever parents are asking what's my child's IQ, that's typically what they're referring to, and it's an indicator of school-related aptitude, and your average cognitive skills index is equal to 100, which is basically, 50%. The scores from the InView provide a highly reliable measure of overall academic aptitude. Remember that aptitude is potential. It's not what the child already knows. It's more proclivity towards things that they have the potential to be good at. When you start to look at the results and the teachers share them with you, you'll find in one corner the information with the child's name, date of birth, all those particular elements. Then the part that's right before the scores lets you know, of course, that it's the InView. Where it says level 1, that doesn't mean anything. And then, of course, grade, the kids take that during 3rd grade, roughly during the first month. It's the end of October. And as you can see, there's a cognitive skills index for this child at 94. There's basically, in this child, it's a range for their lower cognitive skills index of 91 and an upper of 97. That's your band of confidence. The cognitive skills index is an age-dependent score. So if a child has been grade advanced, then the scores are going to look a little different because they're going to be younger than their peers, but that's something that we take into account. Your mean cognitive skills index is the average for that particular group. Standard deviation of 16 can go either way. So when you're just looking at the cognitive skills index without any other scores, what kinds of conclusions can you draw? Let's take a look at this one. Just so you know, you have national percentile by grade, national percentile by age, national stay-nine by grade, and then a scale score. For the purposes of what we do in schools, while we do look at stay-nines and scale scores, they are really just kind of a broad sweeping look. We pay closer attention to what the actual scores are. And if you'll remember, I said that sequences, analogies, quantitative reasoning, all of these go together to create the total nonverbal score. I didn't say math. It's nonverbal, which is mathematical thinking. And then verbal reasoning in words, verbal reasoning context are the subtests that comprise your total verbal score, which is not reading. It's about thinking and how you think with words. And then total score is everything put together. So, as I said, when you were looking at the parts that go together that create your total nonverbal, your 2 true subtests are your sequences and analogies. Quantitative reasoning, while it's part of the total nonverbal, it's not a true subtest. It can be used as a standalone score, whereas sequences and analogies as subtests are not standalone in terms of needs determination for gifted services. Let's take a look at quantitative reasoning. That's more about thinking with numbers and applying the processes rather than learn mathematics. That means it's not about addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. An example of a quantitative item, the teacher reads this. So, reading is not a factor with regard to aptitude. It just tells the student to find the grid with the most black area. And if you'll notice, the kid just has to look at it, and then they just have to determine which one will actually end up comprising the most space. When you look at sequences and analogies, the sequences example, you have those 3 dots, and then it reduces to 2, reduces to 1, so the student would logically select this one. You got to remember, this is part of the total nonverbal, and it's not a math example. It's mathematical thinking. Sequences, you have that blank triangle, then you still have the blank one, but you added one that was colored and turned the other direction, and then blank, other direction, back to blank, and then what makes the most sense is item A. In terms of analogies, normally we think about analogies as being something to do with words, but they also are really about identifying the relationships among picture pairs and making inferences about relationships in terms of incomplete picture pairs. For example, a basic level analogy, you have an egg. We know eggs are in milk cartons or in egg cartons. You have crayons, and we know that crayons go in the crayon box. And remember, this is part of total nonverbal. This is a mathematical thinking process, not addition. In terms of the analogies, this is a little more complex example. You have flowers in a flower pot, and then you have the wildflowers in the field. So you have your horses in your stable, and the thing that would be the closest to that particular picture would be C. In terms of the subtests for total verbal, when we're talking about verbal reasoning words, that's solving verbal problems, reasoning deductively, looking at attributes, relationships, and patterns. For instance, verbal reasoning word, a very basic example is you have airplane, car, boat. Well, looking at your examples, bus is the only one that's going to fit because it's a means of transportation. When you're looking at verbal reasoning with words and a higher level on that, when you go cool, cold, freezing, then you would go warm, hot, boiling. That's a thinking process, not reading and comprehension. In terms of verbal reasoning context, they have to solve problems by drawing conclusions, deductive, inductive reasoning. For example, Alice likes all of her teachers. Mrs. Lee is Alice's teacher. Thus, Alice likes Mrs. Lee. A little more complex example. Big Ben is a clock in England. Judy has visited Big Ben. Thus, we know that Judy has been to England. It's just a thinking skill. When you start looking at the subtests, there's an entirely different picture of this student compared to when you just looked at the cognitive skills index. The cognitive skills index, when you were looking at that 94, leaves you looking in, just below the 50th percentile. But when you take a closer look, let's look at the child's quantitative reasoning skills. It's an 85th percentile. And what that means is that this child scored better in quantitative reasoning than 85% of the other children who took the same test. Well, if you didn't look at the subtest, you'd be looking at that going, oh, well, good average kid, which there's nothing wrong with a good average kid, but we would like to be able to take this information and make sure that we're meeting the needs of the student. So we want to take into account the fact that that child has thinking skills that lend themselves to this kind of reasoning. The other one to really take a look at is that verbal reasoning context. Now, this has nothing to do with whether or not they're a good reader. This is about how do they think? Is it inferences, deductive thinking, taking a look at all of the subtests gives you a much better picture of the student. After you've looked at the scores with the child's teacher, and if you don't, if you have more questions, please feel free to contact the Department of Advanced Learning and Gifted Education, and we will be glad to answer any questions you may